Beckett was in therapy from 1934 to 1936. During this period, he made extensive notes, and before this, he had also written extensive notes called his psychology notes, and they documented his study of the subject. They're in the manuscripts library in Trinity College. Bourgeois was also very fortunate in the analyst that she found. Henry Lowenfeld had a special interest in art. Bourgeois' treatment lasted much longer than Beckett's. Beckett was only in therapy for 2 years. The most intense period of Bourgeois' therapy was 1952 to 1967, but she remained in contact with Lowenfeld until his death in 1985. Bourgeois also studied the field more thoroughly than Beckett, and at one point she planned to train to be a therapist herself. Reflections on their psychoanalytic treatment feature in both their diaries and their letters. Their accounts are usually very emotionally complex. They cover a wide terrain from dismissiveness to frustration, resentment to acknowledgement of the benefits of psychoanalysis. In 1935, Beckett wrote again to his friend Tom McGreevy saying, "I see no prospect of the analysis coming to an end, but I realise how lost I would be, bereft of my incapacitation. When will the old subconscious renounce?" In 1958, Bourgeois listed her complex feelings about her analysis. The analysis is a gyp, is a trap, is a job, is a privilege, is a luxury, is a duty, is a farce, is a love affair, is a rendezvous, is a cat and mouse game, makes me powerless, makes me into a cop, is a bad dream, is my interest, is my field of study, is a pain in the neck. It's much longer than that. I've paired this quote with some examples of Bourgeois' spiral works. She described the motif of the spiral as an attempt at controlling the chaos. And I've included them in different media. So you can see an early etching, an older, like a later bronze sculpture of a spiral woman. She did this spiral figure, the sculptural figure, in many different materials. Then we have a later woodcut, and then a fabric collage from one of her fabric books. Psychoanalysis was crucially important for both Beckett and Bourgeois, for its help in their periods of personal crisis, but also as a means of bringing to the surface powerful emotions and spiraling thought processes that they incorporated then into their creative practice. Beckett acknowledges this in his psychology notebooks when he wrote the phrase, "Psychotherapy is an artistic profession." They both describe creation as an excavatory, challenging process. In January 1959, Beckett wrote to his friend Ethna McCarthy about the exercise book that he was writing in. The exercise book that opens like a door and lets me far down into the now friendly dark. In a similar vein, Bourgeois told the curator Deborah Y to dig and to reveal. That is what I'm after. But Bourgeois could also be scathing about the excavatory impulse in psychoanalysis. She wrote a piece in the magazine Art Forum that included these lines. "It's true that psychoanalysis can be equated with digging, but the analogy is a cheap one. Anytime you are presented with a problem, you dig. You dig in your mind, we all dig for the truth. A cat will dig in the garden to hide its shit. We all dig all day long, so the metaphor is obvious." I see lingering traces of their psychoanalytic treatment in the productive tension that Beckett and Bourgeois developed in their work between formal restraint and powerful emotion. Bourgeois described this in her photo memoir album in terms that apply directly to Beckett's work too. Bourgeois said, "Today in my work there is a strong emotional motivation, but it is held together in a kind of formal restraint. The two things have to be together. The motivation is emotional or murderous or whatever you call it, but the form has to be absolutely strict and pure." This phrase about the motivation for her work being emotional and murderous seems directly applicable in those works featuring body parts. In the 1990s, Bourgeois filled her architectural cells with assemblages of objects, among them marble sculptures of body fragments, such as these marble sculptures of an ear and a leg. Bourgeois and Beckett, another thing in their creative practice, they share an interest in amputating the human form. The broken and fragmented bodies in their work conjure up the eerie, surrealist world of dreams and nightmares, and they were both in Paris at a time that coincided with the surrealists, but they had a limited kind of engagement with surrealism, but it's there. The isolated body parts in their work may also be linked to their experiences of the First World War. One of Bourgeois' uncles died during the war, and they both had uncles who returned from the war traumatized with PTSD. They were both also very struck by the injured men that they observed after the war. In 1938, the year that she met and married Robert Goldwater and moved to New York, Bourgeois was studying at the École du Louvre. Many years later, she described her shock at encountering disabled war veterans in the museum's canteen. She said, "I walk in and look, and a leg is cut off, or an arm is gone, and they're in that basement eating their lunch. And I had such revulsion, such revulsion. I had to do something about this unfortunate occurrence with legs." In Dublin a decade earlier, Beckett too had been powerfully affected by his encounters with the war wounded. In the final year of his undergraduate degree in Trinity, Beckett took to wandering round the city in the evenings. He remarked on the many beggars, tramps, and ex-soldiers wounded or gassed in the First World War that he encountered. So, Bourgeois said of her works that are fragmented, or that feature fragmented bodies, "My poetic license is to remove the arms, to remove the head, and then if I want, to fetch them back." She turned to working with textiles in her old age, in a return to her childhood years when she had helped out in the family's tapestry restoration workshop. So as I said, from the age of 12, she had the job of drawing in the missing feet and legs. Doing that drawing restored the tapestries to wholeness. It completed these gaps, these absences. But her own fabric works are composed of strips and sections of cloth that have been cut up and sewn together in patterns and in shapes that prevent any kind of return to wholeness, any seamless integrity. Her fabric works include sculptures of suspended stuffed fabric body parts, including limbs and torsos, and also fabric heads in vitrines, like this one here. Bourgeois' fabric heads share the same alarming qualities of amputation and expressiveness that characterize the heads of Winnie in the second act of Happy Days here, mouth screaming in not I, and the floating head of that time. So again, I think we see this kind of amputation, this broken body. So it's abstract, it's impossible, but it's also extremely expressive. And there's no explanation for why these bodies are broken up in either of their work. Their very different relationships with their mothers are reflected in many of the maternal portraits in their work. Beckett's earlier writing is very misogynist, but a change happens in 1950 when his mother dies. From this period on, the anxiety, the frustration, the spite that had characterized Beckett's representation of women characters eased. And for the first time, he created women protagonists. All of his heroes, his protagonists, had been men before them. He also created a number of very tender mother figures, one of which in particular visually recalls Bourgeois' representation of mothers as seated figures engaged in sewing or spinning. So Bourgeois' mother was the person who took the lead in the tapestry restoration workshop, and she loved it. She loved it. And Bourgeois loved being alongside her mother when her mother was sewing and she was restoring the tapestries. Rockabye is a play that Beckett wrote in 1981. It describes a widow sitting in a rocking chair, looking out the window, longing for company, but also very connected to her own mother, who sat in the rocking chair in exactly the same way before her. The intimate bond between mother and daughter echoes Beckett's 1976 play Footfalls. And this play too has as its only protagonist an aging daughter, moving slowly, rhythmically on stage, carrying on a private conversation with her mother. So it's an extraordinary change that happens in his writing. There's this tenderness, this awareness of the relationships between mothers and daughters for a writer who hadn't really been able to represent women characters beforehand. Bourgeois spoke quite a lot about her mother's skill at tapestry restoration, her calm patience, her competence, her pleasure in a job well done. These are qualities that Bourgeois documents and celebrates in her work through the motif of the spider that weaves and that protects. The spider is a portrait of her mother, but it's also a self-portrait. In the early 1980s, Bourgeois set up a studio in an abandoned garment factory in Brooklyn. This was a much bigger space than her home. So this huge, enormous space meant that she could work at a larger scale than she'd been able to in the home in Chelsea. And it was here that she started making cells like this one. These are architectural, room-like structures. They invite the viewer to peer into an uncanny domestic scene. In the 1990s, she also started making the huge metal spider sculptures that evoke her mother, the weaver. This particular work brings together both elements. So I'm going to finish up now by looking at the importance for both Beckett and Bourgeois of salvaged fabrics with family associations. They both shared an acute sensitivity to the poetics and the emotional resonance of worn-out fabrics, and they both incorporated fabrics with deeply personal associations in their work. Beckett's work is often considered nearly empty, stripped of the usual elements used for world building in literature. And we spoke about this, we had a really interesting discussion about this in the class yesterday. Within Beckett's minimally imagined world, all of the objects then stand out because there's so few of them. And the paternal greatcoat is perhaps the most powerfully resonant. Bill Beckett, Beckett's father, was said to have kept his son's recent letters on his person, presumably in his pocket. He carried them around with him all the time. After his father's death, Beckett began to dress his characters in the greatcoat that his father wore for the long walks that he loved. These walks are inscribed in the colours of the coat, which echoes the colours of the mountains and the fields that Beckett walked with his father. The coat is described originally as being of a green colour. Over time it fades, it lightens to yellow, or it darkens to black, but the colour green in any case remains to the fore. Several characters describe the greatcoat as a hand-me-down from their own father. The greatcoat remained in Beckett's text for 50 years, passing from character to character and text to text. And I say the coat because over the decades the coat is the same. It's described in obsessive detail. There's a coincidence of colour, length, weight, warmth, and shabby details such as mismatching buttons or frayed material in all of the coats worn by Beckett's male characters. So you have this overwhelming impression that there's in reality just the one greatcoat belonging to his father, but then pulled out of the same imaginary wardrobe for Beckett's characters. So Beckett makes use of his father's coat as a visual but also a sculptural presence in his writing. Bourgeois converts her wedding linen into books. In the 1990s, Bourgeois began making works from clothing and fabrics that had belonged to her family. Her assistant, Jerry Garavoy, discovered a wardrobe and trunks of old clothes in that chaotic house, and he brought them down to her. And Bourgeois said, okay, I can use this. And she used them as raw materials for a series of sculptures, installations, and books. Bourgeois made the fabric book Ode à l'oubli, so Ode to Forgetting, from the wedding trousseau that she had brought with her as a bride to New York in 1938. These items of household linen are embroidered with the monogram LBG, Louise Bourgeois Goldwater, and she makes them the pages of her book. There, you can see that there. Sorry. This is the last slide. This is one of Bourgeois' works featuring a female version of the martyred Saint Sebastian. She described this as a self-portrait, representing a state of being under attack, of being anxious and afraid. The year she died, in 2010, Garavoy spoke about her fabric works. He said, "Sewing is a joining together of pieces. It is a device that corresponds to the alleviation of the fear of separation. If the cut is a wound, then the sewing brings things together. It is a form of reparation." And this brings us back to the Beckett quote I used at the start of the lecture, "Nose knife in Yes's wound." As the readers, listeners, and viewers of their compulsive storytelling, we are the beneficiaries of their ability to so unflinchingly probe the wound and to use it as their raw material. But reparation is possible. In their works that incorporate fabrics linked to their families, they both come closest to this sense of reconciliation and to emotional connection. It is inconceivable to me that they would have continued, Beckett for 60 years and Bourgeois for 70 years, to make work that remains so exciting, shocking and funny, confrontational and sentimental, experimenting all the time with new forms and media, if there wasn't also a profound creative satisfaction in this work. Bourgeois once said, "I want to be the owner of my own trouble." And I think they both achieved that. Thank you.
organize it, but maybe you can put two questions first, then you answer the question. Sure. And then we solve.
I just remember Taylor's call, the creases in a coat or a pair of trousers in family space as onto younger people. These creases and marks of the body, the organs, they call that memory.
Oh yeah, I didn't know that.
This is kind of, I don't know, positive unification of phrases in the code.
That's beautiful, thank you, I didn't know that.
Actually, I really found fascinating the way in which, although that book that she made with the fabric of her wedding dress, is that it, the linen?
Yeah, so it's the linen she was given as part of the trousseau.
Yes, okay, so the trousseau. And it's called Ode to Forgetting, and it's quite paradoxical, isn't it? Because it's also a way for it to become permanent, right? So like like Beckett's gray coat, right? So it's permanently there, as if his father is there, and so there's not really there's no forgetting.
No, there's
in neither cases.
Yeah, not at all. And it's funny, like Joyce, she returns to the river all the time. Like, because they were working in a tapestry restoration workshop, they needed to be beside a river for washing the tapestries. Her mother came up with this use of natural dyes and natural materials because they were such old tapestries. So they used to wash them in the river. They moved from one river to another river. The river is so important in Bourgeois' work. So I don't know, like the Ode to Forgetting, I think there's a sense of, if you use the actual materials, you can maybe forget. You can be guaranteed that it's there. It's like you've captured it, and you can hold it then in this material, this literal material. And you then, in your normal life, maybe you're not so haunted by these memories.
Even the spider that we have in our museum, it's so huge and it makes us feel so little. And then now I'm going to look at that spider and think about Bourgeois' mother. So, yes.
Thank you.
Good.
Hi, Julie. Excellent class again. I wanted to call attention to the processes of creation of them. I mean, I just know Beckett's creative process, but I'm thinking about, like, I know a few of Louis Bourgeois' works, and I think both of them also have this kind of obsession with some figures that repeat themselves throughout the work. And I think I wanted to hear more, if you could say a bit about Louise's creative process, if it's similar to Beckett anyhow, or maybe how she relates to tradition, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like, for me anyway, I find it really rewarding to think of Beckett as an artist, not just as a writer. Like his first television works are considered within video art as the first, he's the start of video art. Like, and so much of his work, it would make total sense within a museum rather than in a theatre. If you have a play like Breath, which is 20 seconds long, you're not going to program, an evening around that, right, at the theatre. And he clearly thought visually. He thought in terms of images. So there's that. But there's, in terms of Bourgeois and Beckett's approach, I feel like they both began intuitively from the medium that they were using. So if Bourgeois was working with marble, she, like Beckett, she was very aware of the tradition she was working within, and she was pushing it as far as she could. So like if she is taking a huge piece of marble, but only reducing it to an ear, there's something that's happening there. There's a sense of rebellion, and there's a sense of, all of you sculptors in marble for generations, for centuries, have been obsessing about capturing the human form I can do it in a year. You know. Or with Beckett, like he's like, I need 20 seconds for a play, and that's enough. I can do it. So that thing of what is a play, what is a novel, what is a drawing, what is a sculpture, and they found that really stimulating. And moving between mediums then, you see it. Yeah, so I think thinking about Beckett as a sort of a plastic artist rather than a writer, even in his texts that are written rather than that are designed for performance, there's this kind of disrespect for the form. They're going to play with it, they're going to try and break it. I love it.
Well, thanks a lot for your lecture, Julie. It's really very enlightening, and I love the way you started it with this shocking phrase as you started your lecture. And I would like to reflect a bit about this, all these bodies in both artists. As you said, both of them are artists, more plastic artists, we would say, even Beckett. And the way these amputations and broken bodies, and then by the end of your lecture you refer to reparation. Kind of reparation. How is the process of this reparation? If we come to, for example, the spider, again, that beautiful sculpture that we had the chance of always going to Mac to the Ibirapuera park that you will go, I hope so, also with Jan, to see it. And then the spider, is it a way of trying, because despite menacing, it is also the figure of reproduction, it is the figure of rebuilding also. I do not know if there is any link in that.
I think there really is. Like Bourgeois spoke about the spider as a protective space.
Mm-hmm.
You're under it and it creates a room. You know, it's like you can fit many people maybe under some of the huge spiders, but some of the small ones, they're just for you. They're just for one person. Some of the spiders have like a sack of marble eggs underneath, and this is like a pregnant spider. But she thought of it as being protected, as a figure that, as a space that holds you, that encloses you, but it's fierce. You know, it's going to, if you're under attack, you're safe. You're safe under this figure. But there's also the thing of the weaving and the sewing and the creativity. They're all kind of coming together because the spiders are also a self-portrait. Bourgeois needed to see herself as powerful and needed to see herself as violent. Like she had to work so long before she got any recognition. There was a retrospective of her work in MoMA in 1982 when she was 70. And this was the start of her creative career. You know, Debbie Y organised it. I spoke to Debbie Y about it. And she organised it because she thought, okay, usually artists die and then there's a retrospective. This was going to be the first retrospective of a woman artist. And Debbie said, I want to do this before Louise dies because they become quite close. And then from that point on, Bourgeois just flourished. And she kept going from then until 2010. And she was given kind of encouragement to be able to think bigger and bigger and bigger, because nobody had been paying attention to her before then. So she was very entrenched and felt like she needed to protect herself, she needed to be powerful, she needed to draw on her resources. So she felt like that spider. She felt like she had to, because she was quite a small woman as well. And she felt like she had to project herself as being huge. In Beckett. So so my students had that more positive interpretation of the phrase, and they were really interested in the idea of reparation, and I like to think that it's there. Like this came up in the class yesterday as well, and I don't believe that Beckett would have continued to create for as long as he did if there wasn't something life-affirming even in that gesture. But there's a tenderness when it comes to materials related to his life, and there's a sense of memory, sentimentality. He's been tender with his characters when he dresses them in clothes. So when his father died, his mother wore widow's weeds for the rest of her life, which was quite an eccentric thing to do in that period. So in rockabye, the figure in the rocking chair is dressed in widow's weeds, and there's something that happens where he brings his parents into his writing, where there's a sense of kind of coming home, and that's a reparation, I think.
I think it's really fascinating this. For me, it almost sounds like a system, like this sentence, like nose, knife, and yes is wound. That you said that it's an attempt to stop compulsive storytelling, but then it creates, as I understood, it opens the wound, and then it creates storytelling again, so it sort of becomes a system in my head.
Yeah.
And then I start to wonder, something that really interests me, if you think, does the art, and it's something that I never actually like to respond, because I don't think we need this answer, but I think it's interesting to think about it. If the artist does the art, like I'm the author, I did it, or if the artist is playing along with a flow, it's not, like if it's, I'm posing a question about who's the starter of this process, you know, and is it within his or her, their power to do it, you know, like when you put this process, when you talk about this process, is it in their power to control this, or do they just flow with it because they need, you know, I was wondering about it. Are they tormented about things and then this make them, I don't know, they need it, or are they tormented about this process, you know, and where is the subject in it, you know, yeah, did it make sense?
It did.
Oh.
It did. No, I'm the same as you. I'm like, I don't really want that to be answered, and I don't really want to come down on one side or the other. Like, I find myself kind of troubled when people speak about art as a kind of self-therapy, or as though art will answer it, or as though that's all it is, or as though you're in control of it. The artist is in control of it. And I think you're absolutely right with the idea of it being a system. It's like, when you look at Beckett moving from medium to medium, you see him starting again, and you see there's a period where he's kind of getting used to what it's possible to do, and he's pushing it further and further and further. So there's that sense of like a child playing with a toy, breaking it, and enjoying it. Like you're just seeing how far you can go. So there's a satisfaction, a creative satisfaction in that. There's a kind of impatience, but there's a knowledge and gaining proficiency and expertise in the form. Because like formally, their work is extraordinary. Like it's so refined. I remember reading a really scathing review of one of Beckett's early plays. I can't remember who it was. It was an English theatre critic, and he said, "This is elegant despair." And he was really troubled by Beckett presenting distressed characters in a very formally refined way. He thought that there was something morally problematic about that. But if it's a powerful emotion that is theirs, then they're controlling it, they're using their expertise. Also just using it as raw material. It's not solving any problems for them. It's not psychoanalysis. So they're profiting from their distress, and they're happy in a way that they're distressed. They're happy that they're not answering the question. But you also made a really interesting point about, is it the author, the artist, or is it the form, the tradition? And I can't reconcile that, and I don't want to reconcile it. Because if you say it's the artist, then you have to think about their intention. And it doesn't belong to them anymore.
Yeah, I think so.